Tonight, we are very excited to welcome Sam Tanenhaus to talk about his book, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. Tanenhaus, the former editor of the New York Times Book Review, is the author of the national bestsellers Whittaker Chambers, A Biography, and The Death of Conservatism. His feature articles and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, and many other publications in the United States and abroad. 10 years before his death in 2008, William Buckley chose Tanenhaus as his biographer to tell the full, uncensored story of his life and times, granting him extensive interviews and exclusive access to his most private papers. Buckley vividly captures its subject in all its facets and phases: founding editor of National Review, the 20th century's most influential political journal, syndicated columnist, Emmy-winning TV debater, and best-selling spy novelist, ally of Joseph McCarthy and Barry Goldwater, mentor to Ronald Reagan, game-changing candidate for mayor of New York. Tanenhaus also has uncovered the darker trail of Bill Buckley's secret exploits, including CIA missions in Latin America, dark collusions with Watergate felon Howard Hunt, and Buckley's struggle in his last years to hold together a movement coming apart over the AIDS epidemic, culture wars, and the invasion of Iraq, even as his own media empire was unraveling. At a crucial moment in American history, Buckley offers a gripping and powerfully relevant story about the birth of modern politics and those who shaped it. The Washington Monthly calls it a grand biography and a magnificent work. Tanenhaus will be in conversation with Elisabeth Bumiller. She is a writer-at-large for the New York Times. She was most recently Washington bureau chief. Previously, she held the position of Washington editor and before that, deputy Washington bureau chief, overseeing White House and domestic policy reporting. She covered the Pentagon, John McCain's 2008 campaign, and from 2001 to 2006, she was a White House correspondent. Please welcome the author and our interviewer.
Okay. Welcome everybody. And I want to, here's the run of show. I'm going to have 30 minutes of questions for Sam, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. And we'll as always, encourage you to ask questions and not make statements. Anyway, congratulations. It is a terrific book. It does not read like it is 1,000 pages long. It is actually, Sam is a great writer. He was a great writer at the Times, and he is a great writer of this book. But it captures him in all of his complexities, all of his ideology. It's particularly revealing about his childhood that we don't know that much about. But I'll get to all that in a minute. What I want to ask you first is just sort of cut to the chase. As the leading intellectual of the American conservative movement in the second half of the 20th century, do we have him to blame or to thank, from another point of view, for Donald Trump?
Well, Donald Trump appears in this nearly 1,000-page book once because he and William F. Buckley Jr. were both character witnesses for Roy Cohn when he was threatened with disbarment in the 1980s. It's a very complicated question because, as a number of people have said, Bill Buckley represented the very worst and also the very best in our politics. He was a brilliant debater and arguer. He was ingenious at looking at questions and controversies from different points of view. He was also a self-described radical conservative and counter-revolutionary. And in 1957, a famous broadcast interviewer, some in this room will recognize, Mike Wallace, said to him, "What's your ambition?" And as a counter-revolutionary. And I wish I could do accents. The great novelist Philip Roth, by the way, did a very good Buckley imitation for me once, and I can't do it. Buckley said, well, my idea of a revolution would be to overturn the New Deal and the view of society that came out of it. So it is possible to say we are seeing the fulfillment of that now. On the other hand, Buckley's protégés, people whose talent he discovered, included Joan Didion, Gary Wills, some of the great writers and cultural critics of the era. They were his friends. He and his wife Pat, the most glamorous literary and intellectual salon in New York City. Now we seem to be getting a little further away from Donald Trump. So that's part of the paradox of Buckley. He was a figure who's a kind of intellectual, erudite, patrician, socialite on the one hand, and he's a revolutionary who means business on the other.
Now to the book and to you. Okay. Those who don't know of you would just listening to your biography that you were a writer for the New York Times, you were an editor of the Book Review. They would assume that you're the embodiment of the left. So what drew you? I think I know the answer already. What drew you to this figure of the great figure on the right?
I got to know Bill Buckley when I was writing an earlier biography of another complex, fascinating figure who came out of first the American left and then the right. Whittaker Chambers, the famous witness in the Alger Hiss perjury trials in the early Cold War. And I knew in order to complete that book, I was nobody from nowhere when I started writing it. I started writing it in 1989. And by 1990, when I had a book contract, I knew that the last great gatekeeper for Whittaker Chambers, who died in 1961, had been his own then very young protege, William F. Buckley Jr. And this is my first big book, and I wrote to him, to Bill Buckley, and he invited me to his home and became a great advocate for that book without knowing anything about my politics, without realizing I was not a reader of National Review. He found that out only later. What he cared about was I seemed to want to get to the truth about Chambers, and he thought I was a good writer. Now, the second one may be in dispute. The first one wasn't. I really did want to know what happened there. And as I got to know Buckley, I realized you have to understand, for younger people here, in 1990, I think it's fair to say William Buckley was the most famous intellectual in America. I used to tell people at the New York Times, if you stood in front of the building and the great novelist Saul Bellow walked by, maybe 2 out of 10 people would recognize him. If it were Norman Mailer, maybe 3 out of 10. If Bill Buckley walked by, everybody knew him. He was on TV every week. So he was really famous and in a large way. But of all the people I met when I started working on that book, he was first the only one who had known Chambers, and the only one who said to me, it's not just about him, it's about you as a writer and whether you can accomplish something. And it really stayed with me. There are a lot of great, large people you meet when you're a journalist. I mean, Elisabeth interviews presidents. Bill Buckley was the only one of that kind of size who took an interest in almost everybody he met. Yeah. So that drew me to him.
That comes out in the book over and over again. Okay, so let's go back. Let's start with his childhood. That is not known to a lot of people. As you say, firing line, everybody saw him. We know about the National Review. We know even about God and Man at Yale. But what was the most surprising thing you learned about him in his childhood? And explain how he got that accent.
They all go together.
Yeah.
He was the 6th of 10 children, 3rd or 4th sons. Anybody here who is a middle child, I was a middle child, knows you're the one who's constantly seeking attention because the parents are interested in the old ones and the young ones. And in Buckley's case, the 15 to 20 household servants on the 47-acre estate in northwest corner of Connecticut are paying attention to everybody but him. So he has to figure out how to set himself apart, and quite by accident discovered he had an extraordinary mind. That's number one. So I think to myself, out of Bill Buckley's loneliness as a child came the American conservative movement. Number two, the family, although they lived in very much Protestant Yankee Connecticut, were Catholics from the Deep South. So they were outsiders even as they were inside this very elite culture. That pattern was repeated at Yale. The Buckley family, Bill Buckley himself, is essentially a Southerner. And that's where a lot of the ideas came from, and a lot of the attitudes, and that unusual accent, which is combined of that and the 3 languages he knew. The first language that he knew was Spanish, the second was French, and the third was English. All those big words Buckley used, he was trying to catch up with his classmates because his English wasn't as good as theirs. Now, not many 14-year-olds will do it by studying the Oxford English Dictionary, but that's Bill Buckley.
So, and the reason he spoke Spanish first was because
his father, who was from Duval County, Texas, some will remember, that's where Lyndon Johnson was elected in his landslide in 1948, Spanish-speaking area of deep southern Texas, but had made his fortune in Mexico, Mexican oil, was fluent in Spanish and kept Spanish household servants. And those were the people who raised Bill Buckley.
basic story. So he became, actually first became well-known when he was a student at Yale, 1946, 1950. And, you know, that really set him on his path to lead the conservative movement, especially after he wrote the book, God and Man at Yale. What is astonishing to read today about what he did at Yale and what he wrote in the book and his attacks on Yale, they very much echo Donald Trump's criticisms right now of Harvard. Now, was Buckley wrong or right?
Both. This is why we have such a problem today. God and Man at Yale was a sensation when it was published. Buckley was 25 years old. It helped that his family had enough money to buy out all the advertising they needed. But as we sadly know, Elisabeth, you've written books, ads don't necessarily sell books. He touched a nerve. What Buckley saw right at the very beginning of the Cold War, right, in those years, the years of the GI Bill at Yale and other great institutions, we've won World War II, but we're entered in this new frightening Cold War, is that in its fundraising and alumni letters, Yale administrators said one thing. They said, send your sons to the great Christian university you went to. And Buckley, who was a speed writer, Buckley was not a huge reader, but he was a great listener. He's kind of like a politician that way. And he learned to speed write when he was in the Army. So he took the notes of his lecturers. And he said, he reported in this book, it was really a kind of muckraking expose. Here's what they're teaching your kids in the classroom. There's nobody who preaches, he says, who even teaches religion. So much for the Christian part. And Yale's supposed to be a free enterprise university, and all the professors teach the heretical Keynesian economics created during the New Deal. So most people said, well, yeah, that's where the country is. That's what Buckley's critics said. But his supporters, who included left-wing journalists at the time, Buckley was the first great horseshoe politician, right? We hear a lot about horseshoe politics now. Everybody knows what it is. It's where the extremes of left and right meet, and what's excluded is the middle. Buckley's critique of his liberal professors just mirrored what left-wing critics would have said. So the great journalist I.F. Stone said, this Bill Buckley's an able fellow who exposes all the liberalistic bunkum of the Ivy League. And it's the hypocrisy that Buckley got at. So when he wrote about what he called the superstition of academic freedom, he said, well, let's do an experiment. Say, really? So what you're saying at Yale is professors have the freedom to say whatever they like. He said, what if I get up in the classroom and I preach racial authoritarianism and the supremacy of white Anglo-Saxons? How long do you think I'm going to last at Yale? He said, he said, they'll run me out of here before the next full moon. And so free speech really turns out to be a term people use to protect the progressive ideology of the moment. So that's the argument the wealthy donors at Harvard and Columbia now make. Two other things about that book. Buckley said there should be an uprising. Donors should stop paying money, and alumni should seek out heretical professors and fire them. So he said in 1951 exactly what we're hearing today. And it was, before there was woke, there was that progressive politics. And Buckley saw strategically how you could make that case. And the additional factor that created the movement we're living with now is Buckley didn't do it as an angry outsider. He was the star of his class at Yale. He was the last man tapped for bones. Some people know what that means. Skull and Bones, famous secret society. In the spring of your junior year, all men, no women at Yale until 1969. This is 1949. All the men who want to be tapped for the clubs gather. They're dressed like me, and they're but much better. Although I am wearing Brooks Brothers today, so I'd qualify. And they're out in the Branford College courtyard, and the members of the senior societies go through the crowd, and they tap somebody. So, oh, obviously, Bumiller's going to be in. We'll tap her. Where's Buckley? They haven't tapped him yet. That builds the suspense for the last man, because the last man tapped is the king of the campus. So here he is at the very peak of the ivory tower. He looks like F. Scott Fitzgerald in his author photo, and he's accusing his professors of being atheistic socialists. So it just created a whole new idea for the right to go after the left. And this is, in that sense, we're living with it right now.
And he also was opposed to federal funding for universities, which is amazing too. Just to put it aside though, so what would he think of Donald Trump right now in his war with Harvard?
It's so interesting because one thing I noticed, some of you will remember that Buckley's most famous public events, what created his public personality, the reason 10 out of 10 people recognized him was because of his debate program, Firing Line. It started in 1966 and ended in 1999. It's a precursor to all the talking head, crossfire type shows we see now. And Bill Buckley was not too choosy about who was on that program, to which I can attest because I was on it once. I never saw Donald Trump invited when he was very famous to be on Firing Line. And in fact, Buckley wrote about him once. In 2000, those of you who may remember, if you remember, you're probably in the sort of get a life category. Donald Trump briefly challenged Pat Buchanan for the Reform Party candidacy. Pat Buchanan's the only big-time politician who defeated Donald Trump. Think about that as well. Buckley then wrote a column, where else? Cigar Aficionado. They paid $5 a word. And Buckley said, well, there's a narcissist. Why would we elect a narcissist? So you might ask, why didn't I just put that in my book? Well, because in 1990, a lot of people said that about Donald Trump. In 2016, a lot of conservatives at first said that about Donald Trump. Who knows where he would have been later? So it didn't feel to me, this is what we do as journalists and reporters, is you hold yourself to a certain standard, not of objectivity, but we'll call it high rationality. And I didn't think that it would be fair to a reader to say, look, Bill Buckley ridiculed him in the year 2000, so of course he would not have voted for him later or supported him later, because I couldn't prove that. So I'll leave it to a reader if you want to track it down. You can find that article very easily. It's just everything shifted so much. I'll add one more thing to that, Elisabeth, which has been the theme, and I've noticed in been many reviews of this book already. Some of them great, like Jacob Halbern's, which you quoted, which Claire quoted, analyzing what the real story is of the conservative movement that Bill Buckley led, and where all the shifts can nevertheless, despite all that, add up to a consistency of argument. And what I found was that it was a movement against. It's against the New Deal. It's against civil rights legislation. It's against civil liberties. It's against progressive culture, just like much of the ideology we hear now. And Buckley himself said he was much better at saying what he opposed than what he favored. So the question then with Trump can always be, well, we don't like Trump, but maybe we don't like the liberals even more than we don't like Trump. And to me, that seems the basis of a lot of the argument today that comes, when Buckley wrote his famous book with his Yale best friend and later brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, it was called McCarthy and His Enemies. There's not much on McCarthy in that book. There's a lot on his enemies. And that's how you'll find in a lot of the discussion from the intellectuals surrounding Trump. And there are more of them than you might think. It's my job to read all that stuff. And there's a lot of it out there. And they make essentially the same arguments Buckley did about the left in his day. That's where the danger comes from.
Well, I was going to just ask you about McCarthy, because, what was his appeal to Buckley, number one, and then we have to talk about his opposition to civil rights, at least in the beginning.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, then we get to some of the news in the book right here. I had not realized how close William F. Buckley was to Joseph McCarthy. As the great historian Ron Reagan is there, I think he's finding this too as you work through the book, that Bill Buckley was a close friend of Joseph McCarthy. He was not defending him only on principle, but out of personal loyalty. That's where we get to Roy Cohn later and the defense of him. And what he saw, Buckley, in McCarthy was something the right had not had before, which was a genuinely populist leader. There were rabble-rousers, right, in the 30s, Father Coughlin and Huey Long. McCarthy made a broader appeal to the middle classes. And if you're Bill Buckley with your 3 languages and your Yale education and your gold-plated vocabulary, and your first hero had been Charles Lindbergh, because some of the early pages in the book are about Buckley's involvement as a teenager in the America First movement. That's the origins of the American right. We know it's the America First movement. McCarthy touched people in a way nobody else had. There was a favorite conservative that the movement had in those years. It was Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who could not get anybody to vote for him. McCarthy could come here and everybody would be gathered around. He'd be slapping him on the back. I don't know how many of you have ever met Donald Trump. I had one phone conversation with him when I was editing the book review. Only president I ever spoke to. And he called me to complain that we didn't put one of his books on the bestseller list. This was in 2010 or something. He was the most ingratiating person in that encounter. It's shocking, but it's true. McCarthy had that ability. McCarthy would come here and he'd find out who all the wage earners were, and those are the ones he'd be giving tips to, the way Trump does at Mar-a-Lago with the $100 bills that go to the guys who park the cars. And Buckley saw that Buckley, and his allies, who were all brilliant in the way he was, super erudite, many of them ex-communists, as he was not. He'd always been on the right, saw how useful McCarthy was and that he was reaching voters in a different way. So Buckley decided, all right, we can't defend Joe, but we can defend McCarthyism, which is very similar to Trump is not perfect, but MAGA, that kind of works for us. That's a movement people can participate in. So it was very strategic, Buckley's part. He saw different factions of the right could be brought together, again, in defense of the guy they think is being attacked by his enemies. So that's where McCarthy became the key figure, I think, in the rise of the right.
So let's go to just his opposition to the civil rights movement. After he founded National Review in 1955 with his family's money, he wrote his famous essay in 1957, where he said that the advanced race, those are his words, should prevail in the South, that is, white people. How long did it take him to change his views on this? How many years and why?
It took him about a dozen years when he actually came to know some black people. Actually, he did know black people in a different context. One of the big discoveries I made in researching this book goes back to the earlier theme we mentioned, Buckley the Southerner. There were 2 Buckley estates, Buckley family estates. So this is when he was being raised. He was born in 1925. And in 1938, his father bought an estate in Camden, South Carolina, which is kind of mid-county, small, beautiful resort town that had become popular for Northerners to go to. The winter colony went to Camden. You didn't have to travel as far in the Streamliner as you did to Miami. So you could get on the train at night, step off the platform the next morning, and you've gone from New York City to Camden. And he bought the house, Buckley Sr. did, for his wife, who felt very uncomfortable and lonely in Connecticut. I mean, this is the age when the matron down the street would deliver her calling card to your house with the top corner turned down, which meant don't bother to call on me because you're a Catholic and you go to the church that's not on Main Street. So that's what the Buckleys grew up with. That's where a lot of the combative quality comes from. In the South, the Buckleys were sons and daughters of the Confederacy who had come home. And so they renovated a beautiful antebellum mansion. Any of you familiar with the great Civil War diarist Mary Chestnut, whose husband was a Confederate general? It was her house. It was the last house she'd built. The father, Buckley's father, was probably more talented and brighter than Buckley himself. Very quick aside, Bill Buckley was not the most talented member of the 10 siblings. His eldest sister was. She had serious issues, including schizophrenia. She was the best writer in the family. That's why Buckley never took himself that seriously as a writer. His son, Christopher, was a better writer than he was, and his elder sister was a better writer. But the Buckleys bought this house, and they lived like Southern gentry. And I tell the stories in the book. My own favorite part of the book is the Buckleys' life in the South, because it shows you how complicated it was to be, I can't do air quotes with a microphone, a progressive white family in the South. What did that mean? That meant for the first time in the history of that small town, when a family like the Buckleys returned north, they would make sure the servants were taken care of back in Camden, find jobs for them, even take them up north with them. And then in 1954 came the most important date in American history, which people used to know all the time. It happened at the same moment that Joe McCarthy was going downhill in his hearings, or Joseph Welch exposed him. The Army McCarthy hearings, the Supreme Court made its decision in the Brown case, Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas. And something called massive resistance built up in the South. So those of you who wonder about legislators or governors who are defying Supreme Court orders, go back and look at what happened in the South. More than 100 national legislators signed a document, the Southern Manifesto, that said we will use every means necessary to stop integration and the invasion of communist agencies, the NAACP, from disrupting our way of life. And Bill Buckley was writing columns that said that. And I thought, how they weren't signed. The one that Elisabeth read, his famous one, was signed. Many of them were not. But I had access to the master issues. So for each issue of National Review, they would initial in the authors of the editorials. And I saw Bill Buckley was writing 90% of them. And in one of them, there's a reference to Camden, South Carolina. And when I read it, I thought, well, what was going on in Camden? He writes about civil rights and race issues as if he has no experience of them. He does it all in the abstract language of states' rights. But he doesn't talk about the South when was spent so much of his life living there, and his family still going back in the winters. So I thought, what I'll do is go down to Camden, South Carolina, and look at the archive there. Because I'd been using all his papers at Yale, where Buckley donated his vast trove. It's like a presidential archive. At his peak, Bill Buckley wrote or dictated 600 letters a week. Not email messages, letters. That's how famous he was. And if you wrote Bill Buckley a letter, he would reply. That's one reason he was a great movement leader. But there's one enigmatic reference to Camden, South Carolina. Only time I'd seen it in National Review. So I went down, my wife and I went together down to Camden, South Carolina. That's how I first learned about Kathleen Parker, by the way, who is a story today, this weekend on the Buckleys in Camden, is that she lived there. And I'd heard about this. I did not meet her, but we corresponded a little bit. And went down to the archive. There's a historical archive in Camden. And I was told there were some Buckley papers there that Bill Buckley's one younger son, Reed Buckley, had donated his archive there. So I spoke to the archivist, a great archivist in Camden, South Carolina. Said, well, I'd like to look at Reed Buckley's papers, and I'd like to look at the newspaper, the Camden Chronicle, which came out twice a week. And she said, I think you mean the Camden News. And I said, no, the paper's called the Chronicle. And she said, no, there's another newspaper that was started by the Buckley family, and we have all the documentation in the archive. She herself had never read it. So I'm thinking, why would you start this other newspaper? So you put it on microfilm. Some of you here probably are still on the old microfilm to look at a newspaper. And you look at page 1, and it reads just like the Camden Chronicle. It's the horse race, the Carolina Cup horse race. You read about the flower shows, the matrons in town who were showing their houses off to visitors. And then you turn it, you get to page 3 and see the announcement from the local White Citizens Council inviting all the white citizens of Kershaw County to come to a meeting of this organization, which is now known today and was then as the Uptown Klan. Thought, well, that's interesting. Why are these documents in the Buckley papers? Because they founded that newspaper, they staffed it, they owned it, and Buckley's sister Priscilla edited it for several years. And that was the basis of that idea about race on the American right. Remember, the old-style Republicans were people like Wendell Willkie, were to the left of Franklin Roosevelt on civil rights. That was the Northern view. Somehow, and historians have told me this, that from their perspective, which is the analytical one, trying to map the growth of the conservative movement, what they could never figure out was how National Review, which if you've read it in its first years, very sophisticated, almost like a British journal, very elegant, abstract language, a lot of talk about the church, about constitutional principles. How do you get from that movement to the anti-civil rights movement and capturing the South? And the answer to that turned out to be the answer to almost every puzzle involving modern conservatism. It all flowed through one man, William Buckley. He brought the South together with the North. So the one thing to add to that, the figure who combined all of that was Barry Goldwater, the political figure. His very first victory in national politics came in 1960. Not 64 when he was a nominee, 1960 when he won the South Carolina nomination at their state's convention. And that was the beginning of the rise of the right in the Republican Party.
So I want to just finish up with that and then ask one last big question, and then we can turn it over to the audience. But you said it took 12 years, because he later said he was wrong, that there was federal intervention was necessary to desegregate the schools in the South. Correct. But it took a long time.
Took a long time. So what happened? Well, this is one of the reasons you write books like this. You go through this massive archive documents. People say we should interview everybody. That's fine, except people misremember or they remember advantageously. But the documents speak to you. They speak to me. And in 1967, when Buckley was still, National Review had opposed the Voting Rights Act on the basis that Negro citizens were not qualified to vote. And that was an argument Buckley also made in that very famous debate with James Baldwin, which I discuss in some detail in this book, of how that debate came about and what was really going on there, and how Baldwin just exposed what the basis of that politics was. Well, after that, and Buckley knew he'd lost. He pretended he'd won, but he knew he'd lost. Then he ran for mayor. When he ran for mayor, which was just a few months later, mayor of New York, which is one of the key events in modern conservatism, because after Goldwater's defeat in 64, and until Reagan was elected governor in 66, there was a gap. And Pat Buchanan, when I interviewed him, told me, in that 2-year period, all we had was Bill Buckley. He was smart, he was erudite, he was funny, he was on TV. He was the only thing they had. Well, in 1967, one of his fans wrote him a letter. It's in the archive. Handwritten, very stylishly phrased, argued, "Note, dear Mr. Buckley, I'm a fan of your program. I like the guests you have. I like your mischievous sense of humor. But answer a question for me. I know you're very close to Senator Goldwater in Arizona. Could you please ask him why I'm going to use the language of the time, so I don't want anybody to be triggered by it. Said, why am I, a Negro, in the United States Air Force, not able to find an apartment for my wife and myself to live in. And there was, in that correspondence, there's a letter Buckley sent him immediately. So this is the height of the Vietnam War. And guess who's going off to fight it? And Buckley says, "Dear Lieutenant James, I'm going to contact Senator Goldwater right away and find out what's going on here." And he does send the letter to Goldwater. And the letter comes back. "Dear Bill, I know that I'm on the record opposing federal civil rights legislation, but I thought we put an end to this kind of discrimination years ago. I don't understand what's going on. So I did what any reporter does. I tracked down Sherman James. He's still alive. In fact, he became a distinguished epidemiologist at Duke. Dear Dr. Adams, do you remember this exchange?" He said, "I remember it very well." And we went back and forth. He told me what happened, that he had come out of the South in the period. He was old enough to remember when Emmett Till had been lynched. And he grew up scared to death. And he said that it could happen to him. And he said, "I heard something in Buckley. I heard that kind of genteel white Southerner I'd grown up with." And so I thought, I learned from him, I thought I could communicate with him. And I think that's what opened the gates up for Buckley. And soon afterward, he was invited to go on a tour of American cities by the National Urban League. And one of the guys who traveled with him was Jack Rosenthal, our colleague at the New York Times, who had written much of the Kerner Commission report on the two societies in America, and who had written some of Lyndon Johnson's famous speeches announcing civil rights. And I said, "Do you remember Bill Buckley there?" He said, "Oh, yeah, I remember him." I said, Jack said, "At first I thought he was this kind of preppy stiff." He said, "But then I realized he's there. He's going from city to city. He's asking the questions." And if you go back and look at Buckley's columns, which you can do if you read newspapers.com. I'm an addict for newspapers.com for anybody else here. You can see columns Bill Buckley wrote in 1969 that said, ironic when we look at the Ivy League today, "Forget Harvard, forget Yale. You want to see the future leaders of this country? Go to the inner city of, go to the ghettos," they call them, in the United States, and you'll hear the voice. You'll hear the voice of the future. And that's when he began to turn around. And in 1970, he said, "What this country needs is a black president." In 1980, that was a statement. And as I say, he died just months before Obama got the nomination. I always wondered what would have happened with that.
Last question. One of the big points in your book is that he was a great public intellectual. He was an intellectual. He was an entertaining intellectual, but he never wrote the big book that summed up American conservatism with his views. So, and this was he was too busy with other stuff. I sometimes wonder if he didn't have a cell phone in those days. He didn't have he was not as distracted as the rest of us, but he did have a lot going on in his life, and he tried to write the big book. He got about 10,000 words down, and that he never made it. And you see this as somewhat of a failing, and the Wall Street Journal review took you to task for this, for blaming.
Oh, did they? I didn't remember that.
Yeah.
I tried not to read too much of the review.
You said you were expecting that review, but anyway.
Oh, I expected them not to like the book. So once I saw they didn't like it, then I stopped reading.
No, anyway.
So is that what they said? That
they blame. Yeah. So do you? I mean, you've just spent 20 plus years writing a 1,000-page book about one of the great figures of the last century. So, but perhaps you do feel he should have done it.
Well, the question is whether he could have done it. Bill Buckley had extraordinary self-knowledge. He knew he was not a scholar, and he knew he was not an intellectual. And I don't want people to think I'm making fun of him, or maybe just a little bit when I say he wasn't really an intellectual, but he played one on TV. Because he understood that that's what his movement needed. He was matchlessly quick and brilliant. If you were in his company, you almost couldn't believe how fast the answer would come to you or the question that would throw you off stride. His mind worked that way. But what he wasn't was a deep reader, somebody who thought, turned arguments and issues over in his head. One of his professors at Yale, Paul Weiss, who was quite renowned philosopher and became Buckley's friend. This is very typical of Buckley. Buckley denounced him and God and Man at Yale. And then when Yale forced him into mandatory retirement, Buckley found a job for him. Not only that, at Catholic University, which he loved. So he found a job for the Jew at Catholic University, and that's the story of Bill Buckley. But what Paul Weiss said about Buckley is, Bill is very good at talking and writing about books he hasn't read. And what's funny about that, that's kind of what a lot of us journalists do. You know, the great columnist Walter Lippmann from an earlier era, who was probably the most erudite columnist of his era, when he would write columns that cited many books, and his editor went to him 1920s and 30s, said, Walter, since you mentioned so many books, why don't you do an annual Christmas list, kind of ahead of its time, of the best books that people should read? And Walter Lippmann said, I've read some of many books. And that's what Buckley did. And you could say he wrote some of many books. His best books, and they're really fun to read, are his memoirs. He's essentially a memoirist, Elisabeth. This was a guy whose life was so busy, he wrote an entire book about 1 week in his life, and 10 years later wrote the same book, right, about another week in his life. That's how he lived. And his idea was to show you, this is what he discovered about himself, what it was like to live and experience America as a conservative. The arguments were the old arguments he'd inherited from his father, and his father had inherited from generations before. The laissez-faire economics, religion, isolationism that then became its inverse, unilateralism during the Cold War. Very basic, simple premises. And what I found that manuscript he couldn't complete. It was called The Revolt Against the Masses. So it's based an extenuation of the famous Ortega book, which Buckley read in Spanish, original Spanish, called Revolt of the Masses. So Buckley was great at titles. So his argument was going to be that the true conservative opposes the masses. Well, then what happened was Buckley ran for mayor and realized he was not running against the masses. He was running in favor as the tribune of his own mass, right? What was then called the white backlash vote, and later was called blue-collar ethnics and middle Americans. We come up with new disparaging terms every generation or so. And Buckley realized he was actually a kind of populist. So there was no argument for him to make. And he had the sense not to try because he tangled himself up in knots. And what I found in that 60 or 80 pages he wrote was not that he couldn't finish his book, but that he couldn't start it. And anybody who does journalism knows you have to have your way into your story. And he never found it because the argument itself wasn't really valid. What he had were, this famously cerebral man, were very powerful feelings, and feelings of affection, closeness to the people around him, antipathy towards the ones he didn't like. Though before we get to questions, it's something, I did a podcast with Andrew Sullivan. He said, well, we're going to beat Joe Rogan. We went on for 3 hours. And he said two things that really stuck with me. This was shortly before the book came out. He said, one, I've read this 1,000-page book, and nobody makes a personally disparaging remark about Buckley. I mean, they may not like him. They may disagree with him. They may think he's done bad things. But they never say he's a cheap or mean or petty person. I found that. I never heard him criticize his great adversary, Gore Vidal. The only comment he ever made. Except
on live television.
And he never lived it down. It was the greatest embarrassment in his life. Whereas Vidal enjoyed it because Vidal had been pushing his buttons for... Vidal was kind of gay baiting Buckley, and Buckley walked right into the trap. But thereafter, he never disparaged him. And I met Vidal's biographer, Fred Kaplan, and he said, well, that's interesting, because I never heard Gore talk about Buckley except to disparage him. The other thing Andrew Sullivan said was, he said Buckley was really a true Catholic, because when you go to Mass, they tell you, live the Catholic life every week, every day. Buckley was philanthropic. He helped out musicians and writers. He found out somebody was writing a book about a Catholic school in Harlem. Buckley wrote him a check so he could continue writing the book. I saw lists of charitable donations he made to historically black colleges and universities, even at the peak of the civil rights opposition. So as a person, he was very large. And when I mentioned the sort of failure of not writing the big book, that was the judgment of some of his acolytes, like Joan Didion and Gary Wills are probably the two most famous, two of the most brilliant writers of our time. And I'm particularly close to Wills. He's 91. I hope to see him in Chicago when I do an event there. They didn't understand why Bill didn't work harder and write better. So Will said to him, ski less and write more. Because Buckley would write at most 2 or 3 hours a day. But once his fingers got on the keyboard, he was done. So there's a famous exchange he had with a TV newscaster, Gene Shalit. And remember him with the sort of electric hair and the big mustache and kind of carnival glasses? And he says to Buckley, well, how do you decide when you're going to write a column? Buckley wrote 3 columns a week, syndicated over 360 newspapers, which is how you did it back then. Potential audience, tens of millions. And Buckley said, well, if I want to, I can just close my eyes, put my finger in a column of the New York Times, run my finger down it, and write a column. And Shalit says, oh, yeah, I think I read that one.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions from the audience. Yeah, I don't think that.
Oh, that's right. You do kind of a lineup thing. Oh, here we go.
Can you hear me okay? Well, thank you very much. This is very entertaining, and look forward to reading your book. If it's as exciting as your comments, it's going to be wonderful. Growing up as a middle child in a 7-member Catholic family, I can identify with Bill Buckley. And speaking of siblings, I assume you interviewed his siblings for your book, and I'm particularly interested in what you may have learned from his brother James Buckley, who was a New York senator. He was a federal circuit judge here in D.C. He died 2 years ago at the age of 100. So I'd like to see what you gleaned from him.
What a great question, because one of the things I was really happy about was to uncover the real history of James Buckley, who was Bill's older brother, and the mother favored Jim over Bill. So Bill Buckley's life was spent trying to win his mother's affection over this indomitably genial older brother, and finally gave up. And it was Bill who had the idea that Jim Buckley should get into politics. So in 1970, James Buckley became the first member of the Conservative Party, a party Buckley had founded in the early 60s, to be elected senator from New York. And what I found was, and great journalist Steve Weissman, who covered the Buckleys, will remember this, there was talk for a while that James Buckley might be on the vice president on a ticket with Ronald Reagan if he could get reelected in 1976, or with whoever the Republican nominee would be. And he couldn't do it. He lost to Daniel Patrick Moynihan in one of the more kind of genial competitions of the era. James Buckley was one of the few members of his generation to hold a senior position in all 3 branches of federal government. He was in the Senate. He worked for Reagan, worked in Trade Commission and Justice Department for a while, and then, of course, was a federal court judge that circuit judge. He was a colleague of Robert Bork, and a very respected jurist, and a very lovely guy whom I interviewed at his senior facility here a few years ago. It was James Buckley who was the first conservative in the U.S. Senate to say publicly that Richard Nixon should resign during Watergate. And it was Bill Buckley who put him up to it. Said, we can only take the criminality so far, and Buckley knew a lot about the criminality because one of his best friends, his former handler in the CIA, was E. Howard Hunt. And after the break-in in Watergate, when Hunt's wife died in a plane crash and Howard was distraught, he went to see Bill Buckley and told him everything. Bill Buckley knew more about Watergate than Woodward and Bernstein and never breathed a word of it. And I'm aware of 2 journalists at the time who called him on it. And one of them is sitting in the front row here, Steve Weissman, who was a friend of Buckley's. He'd been kind of a mentor to you. And Steve Weissman was one of the few people who said, Bill Buckley seems to have kept some secrets to himself for a long time. I don't see how a journalist could get away with it now. But what I've been told, when I talked to Mike Isikoff for his podcast, he said, well, 10 years ago, a journalist could not get away with covering up for a president like that. But now you could, if you're on that side.
Hi, 2 questions. First, if you'd had another 100 pages to cover the last 20 years of his life in particular, what would you have focused on? I find his writings on immigration, Islam, and Europe actually prefigure contemporary right in a lot of ways. But what would you have chosen as the most interesting things to look at? And second, what do you think he would have made of this book, having given you so much access, all of his documents on, and you've written what I think is a very kind of open, warts and all portrait of him? What do you think he would have made of the final product here?
We'll start with that and then get to the first question. It's a question I ask myself a lot that some other people are asking too. I think Buckley knew that when he decided he wanted me to write it, he would not have a book written from inside the church, the church of the movement, because there were already books like that, and they tend not to do their subjects much good, is one reason. The other is Buckley was a huge person. He had many, many facets. And to do him justice, you have to try to capture the sweep of his life. Now, I don't say necessarily I succeeded, but that's what I wanted to do rather than just show him to be the idol of a movement, that there was the other side to Buckley. The question you ask about the last years is very interesting, too, because it comes up a lot. Why not have more in those last years? I actually wanted to have more on the original family. I have many, many pages on the family's origins in the South and in Mexico and all the rest, and there wasn't room for it. It seemed to me that a paradoxical thing happened with Buckley, which was that once his great protege, Ronald Reagan, was elected, Buckley's place had kind of been ceded. Richard Nixon needed Buckley in a way Ronald Reagan did not. And when Buckley and National Review made the mistake of saying they had put Reagan in office and we have a nation to run, it's a little far for the editor of a journal to make. So Buckley was kind of, he wasn't ever exiled, but his place was usurped by others, including one of his many proteges, George Will, not to be confused with Gary Wills. What would I have emphasized in the last years? I think what you would have seen was more on topics that I moved through more quickly. The battle over anti-Semitism. That's a question that's come out, that's come up now, because Buckley was a defender of Israel during the first Iraq War and was critical of some of those on the right, like Patrick Buchanan, and an editor on his own staff, Joe Sobrin, who were extremely anti-Israel and accused of anti-Semitism. And Buckley wrote a famous little book called it In Search of Anti-Semitism. But where did Buckley really find the anti-Semitism? He still found it mainly on the left. And in fact, he supported Buchanan when he challenged Buckley's friend, his Yale friend, George H.W. Bush. So I thought those later demonstrations by Buckley actually were thinner and slighter than they seemed. I think the question about looking at issues like religion and Islam and so would have been very important. My wife and I heard Bill Buckley give a lecture in 2001, and the hero of his lecture was a former antagonist whom he'd been quite aggressive toward, Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King. And he said, we honor Dr. King today because he brought spirituality back into politics. That's where Buckley could always be interesting. I would have looked at that maybe a little more than I did. Is Buckley also dealing with the crisis in his own church and Catholicism? Those would have been some of the questions. Did you have a follow-up that you want to add?
No.
Oh, yeah? Okay. But that is an interesting question, the later Bill Buckley. Yeah, for sure.
You've written about how many of the leaders of the post-war conservative movement started out on the left. And while they moved to the right, they still had a revolutionary intensity to them and fervor. given that Buckley did not start out on the left, unlike the people he brought on National Review, to what extent was he a revolutionary in terms of his sensibility, unlike some of those people who started out on the left but moved to the right?
Wow, that almost sounds like a PhD question. All right, I'm gonna try to answer that. First thing I'm going to say is I don't think it's true I've said that many who were on the right came out of the left. I think I said almost every single one of them by Bill Buckley. There's a famous comment, Ron Reagan, who's an expert on this, will know it. Somebody said, I hate all communists, but especially anti-communists, because they started out as communists. What Buckley had was a kind of sense of exuberance, freedom, and optimism that those other figures like Whittaker Chambers and James Burnham and Willy Schlamm, who was an Austrian emigre, and had all been part of the communist movement. They saw politics in apocalyptic terms. Buckley never went quite that far. He actually saw it as a field of conquest where his side could win. And the first victories had come at Yale. He is going to write the editorial that makes everybody mad, and yet he's going to be the last man tapped for Skull and Bones. So he saw it almost as a kind of social conquest. That's why when he started the magazine, these other people, by the way, were all 20 years older than he was. The first issue of National Review was published when Buckley was 29 years old, and he's already famous. He's already the most famous conservative in America. He's not 30 yet. And they knew that he brought glamour to the movement that no one else did, and optimism. And because of that, also, he was not, they were all conspiratorial in some ways, just as so much of our politics is today, but he was not paranoidally conspiratorial the way some were. Some of them really thought there were plots being hatched all around them. Buckley had a wider view than that. And he also liked the big tent argument. If you agree on the big things, we'll let you in. I remember asking him, not near the end of his life, one of the famous things Bill Buckley did was to turn against the second George Bush during the Iraq War. That was his big break with the movement. And it's interesting, one reason he did it was because his very oldest friend, a great journalist from England, who'd been his boyhood schoolmate, classmate in Dutchess County, New York, wrote a great book about the Algerian Revolution, Alistair Horn. And Buckley read it, and he said, this is what we're doing. We're a big power that's doing all the wrong things with a colonized people. And so he had that kind of largeness about him. He didn't feel locked into the either or in quite the way those other revolutionaries did. Although I have to add, in defense of my own first subject, Whittaker Chambers. Chambers was the one who was trying to tell them all along, Eisenhower may not really be an evil communist. He just may be a kind of normal Republican, and maybe the country likes him. That was far to the left of the National Review perspective. But not that they called, there was one guy who called Eisenhower a communist, and Buckley excluded him. He excommunicated him, Robert Welch of the John Birch Society. But Buckley and company were fairly close to them. They had that conspiratorial view. They did see a lot of enemies all around. Buckley had that sense too. It was the main difference, I'd say, was temperamental. He would come here and he'd laugh. He'd say, oh, so you joined the Communist Party. Does that mean they'll have a meeting so you won't make it to my house for dinner tonight? And then that would be the end of it. And nobody does that anymore, I don't think. He took it less seriously and took himself less seriously than we all take ourselves.
Yeah, I feel this question is going to sound like comparatively light after a lot of that, but I love the scene in the book where Fats Waller comes to perform at the Buckley household. From what I understand, he had a cousin or something that was in the staff at the work. But it surprised me a little bit to know that, like, Buckley himself, like musicians like Fats Waller, because like later he would rail against Beatlemania and other things, and come across just as part of his public persona as kind of a crank about popular music. But I mean, did you see other evidence of in his archives of him being like hip and with it about like?
Well, there's a funny incident that happened. Well, the Fats Waller incident is great. I'm glad you brought that up, because to me that was the first sign of what's really going on in the Buckley household. So, and how are we for time, by the way? We're right. We're about at 6 o'clock because we have to get books signed, right? So let me quickly answer this.
Maybe, how many people are there?
Well,
can pass. I just want to make a speech anyhow.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, let me answer the question
Yeah.
first, though. Buckley liked jazz, and he liked show music, and he eventually came around on the Beatles. But one of his neighbors was a really famous disc jockey, Alan Freed, and he invited, right, he's the guy who invented the term rock and roll, and he invited Buckley over to his house, and Buckley said, well, so Mr. Freed, what do you think of Elvis Presley? And he said, oh, Elvis Presley is a great young kid. He makes more money than I do. He's from Mississippi, and he calls me Mr. Freed. And he said, would you like to come over and listen to some Elvis Presley music? Buckley said, not right now. And then later, one of the worst books, Buckley wrote a lot of books. He wrote some good ones and some bad ones. One of the worst books he or any other novelist ever wrote is called Elvis in the Morning. And life is, even my life is, was too short. I made it all the way through, but just once. Everything else I read 2 or 3 times.
So do we just have people ask questions and then you can all in a row, and then you can answer them in a row?
Yes. Oh, that's a good idea.
So why don't we have 2 people there? Okay. So why don't you just both ask questions, and then Sam will answer them in one big answer.
My brother was with William Buckley at Sharon, Connecticut when Young Americans for Freedom was founded. But later on in his life, he forgot he was anti-communist. What do you think happened there?
Wait, who forgot he was anti-communist?
I'm sorry?
Who forgot he was anti-communist?
Well, my brother
Your brother
forgot
did.
he was anti-communist.
Oh, I see.
Let's get to another question.
Yeah, and then we'll answer them both. Right, Young Americans for Freedom, founded on the Buckley family estate.
Hello, Sam. I'm Robert Nettlekoff, who used to listen to the Nixon tapes. I've talked to you at Book Expo a while back. In the chapter discussing the mayoral race, you indicate something that not really occurred to me before, namely that Buckley, besides the evident purpose of the race, in other words, to help shore up the conservative movement after the gigantic Goldwater defeat, also had in mind ensuring that John Lindsay would not become mayor, even if it meant putting Abe Beame into Gracie Hall. Can you say to what extent his mayoral race was motivated by a partisan purpose like that rather than an ideological purpose?
Well, actually, yeah.
So you want to answer the first one
right,
first and the second one first?
What happened? I'm not quite sure I understood what happened to the who forgot he was an anti-communist. I mean, Buckley didn't certainly forget that he was an anti-communist. Do you mean your brother did? Yeah. Oh, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of people around us now who don't even remember communism very well. And so maybe that's what happened. It's easy to forget. Buckley was one of the few people. Another was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And a third was one of his many heroes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who actually thought the communists would be defeated in Buckley's lifetime, and they were. As far as the political race goes, I would say that was ideological rather than partisan. Because if he were partisan, he'd want the Republican to win. And the Republican did win, but Buckley thought he was the wrong kind of Republican. And what he ended up doing was putting Lindsay in a corner, and after Lindsay's second term, when he decided to re-enter politics, he did it as a Democrat. And Buckley had pretty much put him there. Walter Lippmann, again, the great columnist, said, Buckley seems to want to destroy the Republican Party. And so my conclusion was he was half right. He wanted to destroy that Republican Party and build a new one, and that became the party of Buckley, Goldwater, Reagan, and then there's a ... and I see a debate going on within the conservative movement now. When they write about my book, I've noticed it's turned around. First, with these attacks that Elisabeth mentioned. Now there's all this praise coming. And I was trying to figure out why that is. It's because they think if you read the Buckley story in the right way, he becomes the great intellectual who paved the way for Donald Trump. So they've decided the book is actually a good thing. I say, I don't know. I think the stories are good.
On that note, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elisabeth.